So our next presenter for the day is Moniek van Rheenen. Moniek is a PhD student in linguistic anthropology at specializing in Indonesian Islam. She received her BA in English and Spanish from Cornell University in 2014. As a recipient of the prestigious David L. Boren Fellowship, Moniek was a visiting scholar this spring at both the Andalas University in Padang, Indonesia, and at the Center for the Study of Islam and Society at Hidayatullah State Islamic University in Jakarta. Moniek would like to change the assumption that Westerners often have of the, quote, oppressed Muslim woman in need of liberation, unquote, while bringing attention to the fact that Indonesia is the largest Muslim majority nation in the world. Please join me, everyone, in welcoming Moniek. Thank you.
With a Kahoot game. If you're not familiar with it, if you go to kahoot.it, I'm sure many of you might have used this in your classroom before. I was a former high school Spanish teacher at Oakland Catholic High School in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and this was really popular with my students. But anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit about Islam in Southeast Asia, which is a lot of people, when they think about Islam, they think about, in the Muslim world, they think about the Middle East, and that's a lot of what our media portrays. A lot of my experience since 2014 has been in Southeast Asia, working with Muslim majority populations. So this is just a little bit of some knowledge just to see what you know, and just some fun facts along the way to kick us off. So is everyone more or less logged in? Yes? No, not yet? The most competitive I've seen Kahoot is at teacher workshops. So, yeah. 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 The champ. All right. All set? Yeah? Sure.
As people are logging in,
Mm-hmm.
I know many of you have really great resources that you're already using in your classroom. If you can write any of those resources, you can stick them right on the door over here, and then we can send them out to everybody afterwards.
All right. All set? Great, we'll get started. All right. So what is the largest Muslim majority country in the world? This one's a bit of a freebie. Yeah, so Indonesia is the largest Muslim majority. It is not a Muslim nation, but the largest population with about 87% right now. So what percentage of the world's Muslim population lives in Southeast Asia? So about 40%, so almost half of the world's population, mostly in Indonesia, Malaysia, and in Brunei as well, though also parts of southern Thailand. All right, Islam is the official religion of which Southeast Asian country? There are two correct answers here, so you have a 50-50 shot. You just hit one, but there's two that are possible. So Malaysia and Brunei are both officially Islamic states. All right. So how did Islam come to spread to Southeast Asia? So most of this was coming through we'll talk about this a little bit, through the Silk Road and through a lot of the maritime trade routes in the early eras of globalization and migration. So we talk a lot about holy wars, and a lot of this was very just kind of passive merging of cultures. So in which century did Islam arrive to Southeast Asia? This is up for debate, but this is kind of the most commonly accepted answer. No. Not with me. Yeah, so early most scholars agree that around the 13th century is when Islam arrived in Southeast Asia, primarily through Arab traders, and then also through some of the routes through India as well. In which Southeast Asian country is Arabic recognized as a national language? So the Philippines, actually, which is a Christian Catholic majority nation, but they recognize Arabic as one of their national languages. I think. And which percentage of Indonesians identify as Muslim? Yeah, so about 88% are Muslim, and then after that there's Christian, Protestant, and Catholic, Hindu, and then Buddhist, and then local religions. And last question, how many mosques are there in Indonesia?
You didn't tell us this.
So there's about 800,000. By comparison, in the US, there's about 400,000 Christian churches. In America, there's about 400,000 churches. And I grew up in a town where there's a church on every corner. So, but in Indonesia, it's different than in the United States, where a lot of people belong to a congregation. In Indonesia, most times people go to the closest mosque to pray during the time of prayer. So it's less about membership and more so about having a space to go and pray, or to rest, or to read the Quran, or to spend time. Yeah. So with that, my presentation focuses on Islam in Southeast Asia. A lot of what I do is I've looked at youth culture, which is primarily what this will be about. I taught as a Fulbright English teaching assistant in Indonesia in 2014 at a public senior high school. And then my research brought me back to look at migration in Sumatra and looking at how youth use different local languages. And my current dissertation research is about Muslim women activist groups and their political involvement, especially after Indonesia just finished its presidential election, and thinking about the ways that, again, portraying Muslim women and how they become activists in the community. I work with primarily very conservative populations and communities, so thinking about the story that we see coming from the Western media of the oppressed woman versus what's actually happening in Indonesia, and just the fact that Indonesia is often not recognized as kind of this big part of the Muslim world, both globally, just in general, and also sometimes I find when I'm working with other Islamic scholars that Indonesia is often on the margins along with the rest of Southeast Asia. So this is a way to think as well about when we're talking about the Muslim world and Muslims around the world, what we're talking about and the diversity that we're recognizing with our students, and also just giving a comparative approach. When I taught high school at a private Catholic school, my students were very curious about other students that lived in other parts of the world and what their lives were like. So this is also an opportunity to think more comparatively and to think about other cultures and the way that people live their lives, and recognizing that teenagers across the world are pretty much very similar. Justin Bieber was a big thing when I was there. But a lot of it is just recognizing that there's a lot of similarities amid the differences. So my goals with this, first of all, thinking about Islam in Southeast Asia broadly. With this, I'm thinking about some of the different areas of study that you teach and different ways that this might be able to be incorporated, looking at some of your responses for what you're interested in, so thinking about world history, comparative government, visual studies and art, literature, different ways that this might come in. Afterwards, I'll focus more on Islam in Indonesia. That's really where my experience has been and where my knowledge is. And after that, talking more anecdotally about Muslim youth in Indonesia from my experiences both as a teacher and as a researcher and in the relationships that I built and maintained while I was there. And finally, we'll end with some brainstorming for you all to think about ways of incorporating this with what you learned from the presentation earlier and what you'll learn later on today, and thinking about different ways of using this as a tool both for what you teach and for also addressing some of the misconceptions and the Islamophobia that we unfortunately face in our country and our communities. So in Southeast Asia, you have about 100 million, or almost 1 billion of the world's Muslim population is in Southeast Asia. So when you look at it like this with the circles, a lot of what we think about is Indonesia centered in the Middle East. Right now, I'm actually in town I'm taking an intensive Arabic course at the University of Pittsburgh with a Jordanian professor who was very surprised to learn that Southeast Asia was the Muslim majority region of the world, which has sparked a lot of conversation in the class that I'm taking, but even among Muslims themselves, that it's not always well known, but thinking about the way that it's spread. So a lot of what is the Muslim population is in Southeast Asia. What happens, though, is that a lot of the conversation is thinking about defining Islam. And in a lot of my Islamic studies courses, what we think about when we talk about Islam is something that's very fluid, that's constantly being negotiated. So a lot of times people will think, well, in Indonesia, is it really Islam? Is it an Indonesian form of Islam? Where do we draw those boundaries about what counts as Islamic practice, what is cultural practice, who decides what those things are? So you have different versions, and we'll see some of those, of Javanese practices of the call to prayer that are very popular in Java, but when you look in the Middle East, they're considered to be non-Islamic. Or you think about different practices that come from the Middle East into Indonesia by way of people going on pilgrimage, people moving back and forth for work, especially in this day and age, where things become mixed up on whether this is Arab culture, or this is part of Islamic tradition, or this is Indonesian. And a story when I was in Jakarta at the State Islamic University is one of the most well-known professors came to the mosque in Mecca to pray, and he was wearing an Indonesian batik shirt, which is usually these beautiful, intricate floral patterns. And he was told that he could not enter the mosque because he was wearing women's clothing. And he looked at the man that told him he couldn't enter, who was wearing one of the longer garments that are typical in Saudi Arabia, and he said, well, in my country, you're wearing a dress. So it's these negotiations that happen about what counts, where, and who decides. And so he did enter the mosque, and it's his favorite story to tell about these different ways that Islam is recognized. So it's also, Indonesia is proud in the way that it stands apart, but also is trying to be recognized as part of that broader Muslim community in the world. So if you look at the map, you have the Muslim population in Southeast Asia, where Indonesia is the largest population, followed by Malaysia, and then the Philippines, especially in the south. If you are up on your current events last year, thinking about Mindanao was a big part of that, so southern Philippines especially. Same with southern Thailand and Myanmar. Singapore, because you have a lot of back and forth of people from Malaysia and Indonesia coming in for trade and working in Singapore, just because it's a lot more lucrative. Brunei as a Islamic government, and then Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos. So you have these populations that aren't always recognized. We think of the Philippines as a primarily Catholic country, and thinking about the Spanish colonial period in the Philippines, but we often forget about the fact that there are these different areas. So we'll take just a couple minutes for a think, pair, share, if there's anything that surprises you about this, and why Southeast Asia? What might be the reason that Southeast Asia came to be this region where Islam was not born in Southeast Asia, but it came to be this large, important region in the world? So we'll take a minute just to think. After that, we'll take 2 minutes to share with someone or your table sitting around you, and then we'll open up as a group and we'll share some of our ideas. So go ahead and take some time to think and talk it through. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So we can bring it back together. Is there anyone that wants to share either something that you found interesting or surprising by this, or reasons why Southeast Asia? Mm-hmm.
Would anyone like to volunteer?
Mm-hmm.
Anyone? I think they're still busy talking.
Any thoughts on why Southeast Asia? Trade. What about trade?
Oh, no, I get the microphone. Oh, Lord. Yes. We were just thinking about the trade routes because they're, the sea, it's all surrounded, all islands, so it would be easy to get from one place to another if you had a boat. Our other question, though, is with the percentages the way they are, the countries that have a lower percentage, not just raw numbers, but the lower percentage, is it because they were colonized by the British, the French, and the Spanish, but that Indonesia is such a high percentage, but Singapore is only 16%.
Mm-hmm.
So we're just trying to figure out the differences in the percentages.
Yeah, colonialism plays a big part in it. The thing with Indonesia is geographically and thinking about the area of the land is I think, fourth largest country. in the world for landmass, and because it's an archipelago, so that you have to think about for colonization how difficult it is to manage 12,000 islands of people. Versus if you're looking in somewhere where you think about Malaysia being colonized by the British, that you don't have as much land to control. And with Indonesia as well, so you have especially in the east, you have the Spice Islands. So cinnamon especially was very big for trade in the 13th century. So thinking about, and exactly like you said, with trade, the fact that when you're going by ship as opposed to land, that people move a lot faster and people can move more frequently. So thinking about the archipelago. For Indonesia especially, and proximity, because you're close to India. It's not a surprise that the majority of Muslims in Indonesia live in Sumatra, because it's closest to India, it's closest to Saudi. So when traders landed, they're going to look for the first piece of land they see. So that's a big part of it. Other thoughts? Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering if the Myanmar number would need like adjusting after recent events with the genocide, or if the Rohingya were a small percentage of that projected 4%.
That's a good question. Something that I know less about, I have a colleague who works he's actually in Myanmar right now doing research with the Rohingya population. I think with a lot of that, because so much of it is talking about when you look at, you have Bhutan up here, so you have kind of this idea, are they Bhutanese, are they Burmese, and this idea. So the numbers, I mean, and you think as well about how people, when you think about surveys, the choice to self-identify is, well, I can claim Burmese heritage on this side, so I'm going to do that to protect my family. So I think this was from 2015, so about when it was becoming more difficult. So yeah, some of these numbers, and it's also thinking about surveys, how many people are choosing to identify themselves and how data is being collected. We have that thinking about our census coming up next year as well, what's being asked and how people are answering. So other thoughts? Sarah?
Okay, so I'm from Malaysia. I was trying to remember my history a little bit. So besides trade, there could also be marriage. So the Arab traders would stay in like Malacca and they would marry women, and that was one way of like how Islam spread in Malaysia. I don't know for the other countries. And also, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of the sultans in the 9 states we have in Malaysia, they adopted Islam as like something they should practice, and they also encourage their people to also convert. So I think that's how there's a lot of Muslims in Malaysia.
Yeah. Religion and politics are hand in hand, and a lot of times, especially thinking about colonialism in Indonesia, Indonesia was colonized by the Dutch, and at times the Dutch tried to take advantage of this Islamic identity to bring people together, to make them more governable. And other times, especially with the Padri Wars in Sumatra, trying to, because of this fear that this coming together of Muslims is something that could overthrow the Dutch government. So this idea of trying to break apart these Muslim communities through these wars and putting them against each other. So using this as a political tool for governing, which again comes hand in hand with colonialism. But you get all of these different reasons about why these different areas become more populated than others. So moving on, my focus is primarily, so Sarah knows a lot about Malaysia, and we'll hear from her later on in the panel at the end of the day. My focus is mostly in Indonesia and a lot of my experiences there. So looking at Indonesia, the 2 red areas are where I've primarily spent time. And you get a great look as well just about kind of how the country, it's almost a gradient about the different religions that are represented. So in Indonesia, there are 5 major religions. You have Islam. This map splits it between modernist and traditional, but I think that's a little misleading in the ways that most people in Indonesia, if I ask them, are you modernist or traditional, they'll just say, I'm Muslim. So they don't identify themselves that way. Protestantism and Catholicism are split into two separate religions. And then you have Hinduism. So everyone that knows Indonesia knows Bali, which is the largest Hindu population. And then you also have some Buddhism as well, and that's primarily with Chinese Indonesians. So when you look and you think about in the East, was a lot of the Dutch evangelists were in the East, the Protestants. So that's why a lot of the Eastern Indonesia, and especially thinking about the Dutch coming in for the spices in Indonesia, that's why a lot of the East is more Christian. The West tends to be more Muslim, but you do have intermarriages, you do have kind of people that mix practices and religions, but it's thinking mostly. So I've spent most of my time in West Java, which Jakarta is the capital. That's where I spent a lot of my time. Previously, I was teaching in Riau province in a city called Pekanbaru, which is about 92% Muslim, and then going back and forth to the villages in West Sumatra. And then in the green is the province of Aceh, which is the only province in Indonesia that is under Islamic law. And a lot of people that identify as having Arab descendants through these trade networks from before. So that most of Indonesia is a secular nation, but when you look at the state ideology, Pancasila has 5 pillars. The first one is belief in the one true God. And it's this idea of that people identify with a religion, of one of the main 5, which is on your ID card. But this idea that religion is important to both national identity and to self-identity. And it's very much played out there in the United States. We have separation of church and state. Religion often becomes a taboo subject. In Indonesia, it's very open and it's very visible. So if you look at worldwide, we know that Indonesia has the largest Muslim population. Following that, we have Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Egypt, Nigeria, Iran, Turkey, Algeria, and Morocco. So does this surprise anyone? I know for me, I thought that Saudi Arabia would have been on there, but does anyone have any thoughts about these countries? This was in 2010, so the numbers might have switched, but. Does this match people's expectations? Pretty much. A little bit? Is there something different? Oh, so you had this already. Yeah, but thinking about this is, and a lot of it has to do, Indonesia has about 247 million people, so it makes sense just by population in general that they would have the largest amount by virtue of being one of the largest nations in the world. So you look at this historically, and you think about the early modern trade routes. So not just silk, and so you have in red, you have the Silk Road, and then you have the sea routes. And all of these, especially the sea routes, are the ones that lead down into Indonesia, which used to be divided up into kingdoms, so Sriwijaya, and then the Spice Islands out in the east. But you have this great network where you look at everything coming from the Middle East and through the subcontinent here, coming down through India, and then coming further down. But a lot of this is this was all pre kind of European, the golden age of exploration. But all these, so like we said before, all of these networks that are coming through and landing in Indonesia. So the first to come through were the Spanish from Europe, coming in through the Philippines and then down into Indonesia. And then after that, the Dutch East India Company coming in and then staying in Indonesia up through the 1940s, through the Second World War. And primarily for trade and for economic reasons. And there's still a very close tie. My family is Dutch, so working in Indonesia and having a Dutch father who has learned a very different history than I have is always interesting. So Indonesia claims that they gained independence in 1945. My father will tell you 1949, and this is not something that we will ever agree on. But thinking about just a lot of Indonesians during the 1960s, went to the Netherlands for education, a lot settled there. My father knows fried rice. He knows some of the shrimp crackers are called krupuk. So, and a lot of words come from Dutch, especially for education in Indonesian. A lot of words like coffee is kopi. So you see a lot of that history still kind of under the surface. And then you have the Hadramis, which in Indonesia is a mark of status. So the Hadramis originally were from a province in Yemen. And in Indonesia in the 70s, a lot of Muslims were going to the Middle East, especially to Yemen, for education, and then coming back to Indonesia and becoming a lot of the popular Muslim scholars and clerics, and the ones that were starting Islamic boarding schools. And especially in Aceh, where you have a lot of people that are of Arab descent and proud to be of Arab descent. So you do have these remnants of a past, of these networks that came through of people that identify themselves and are in positions of power because they identify as Hadrami or having these mixed backgrounds. And a lot of that was coming from trade as well. And so Indonesia, oftentimes, if you look in the media, is upheld for being this pluralistic nation and one of the more tolerant nations where you have these main religions that coexist peacefully. The motto of Indonesia is Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, which is unity in diversity. So it's this idea that you have all of these diverse religions, diverse ethnicities. As a linguist, there's about 7,000 languages in Indonesia. You're spanned across about 12,000 islands, and yet it's still a single nation. It's been called the improbable nation, the fact that it hasn't split up into different little sub-nations. So it's this idea that's really ingrained in Indonesian culture, is this idea of unity and diversity, of understanding and respecting differences of your neighbors, and that being something that children learn in school and that people tend to preach, and Indonesians themselves will contrast themselves against and there are instances where there's kind of ideological differences. Usually those come from politics, or they come from, some of it is just old family rivalries, or ethnic conflict that gets conflated into religion, but for the most part in Indonesia, that is just this peaceful coexistence and people being very open and open-minded about religion. And one of my favorite ways to illustrate this is you have in Jakarta, here you have the Masjid Istiqlal, which is the national mosque. And right across the street, you have the St. Mary of the Assumption Cathedral. And so you see on Sundays, it overlaps, you see the Catholics going in for Mass, and they come out, and then you see the Muslims going into the mosque for their afternoon prayer. So it's just this idea that you have in the heart of this city, you have these two large places of worship that look directly across each other. And I think for me, that's one of my favorite ways that this illustrates this idea of unity and diversity. And religion as well being something, so we think about, like I said earlier, this kind of taboo of talking about religion. In Indonesia, it is something that is listed on your national ID card. So this idea of both choosing one of the main religions to belong to that is recognized by the state. Just recently, they passed a new ordinance that if you practice a local religion, so a lot of the animistic religions that are really kind of the pre-global, the pre-Islamic religions that are practiced in Indonesia now can be recognized on your ID card, as well as Confucianism. So there are conversations about opening this idea of how people identify, but it's something that everyone has, that everyone will. And it's one of the first main questions that I get asked when I go to Indonesia is, what is your name? Are you married? What is your religion? Which, yes?
In Indonesia, to what extent is Islam spoken outside of the religious context?
Outside of religion? Islam?
So, Moniek, would you repeat his question, please?
Yeah, so the question is, to what extent is Islam spoken about outside of a religious context? Arabic.
In what sense is Arabic spoken outside of the religious context?
So Arabic is taught in schools as a foreign language a lot of times. That's becoming increasingly more popular with Chinese as well for students that are looking to go into business. I still find it in Indonesia, as I'm learning Arabic right now as well. I'm very elementary. But a lot of it is people that learn to read. They go to these after-school programs to learn to read Arabic. And it's mostly sight reading. It's sight reading and it's pronunciation in order to read the Quran. But to have someone who's conversant is usually someone who's involved in business. So it's becoming increasingly popular as both a high school elective and as a college major. Yes?
Is there means of, is there, do people, if you left that, your religion, excuse me, if you left your religion blank, do they use that as a form of discriminating against you for certain privileges? And my second question is, do the more worldly Islamic people consider Malaysians Islamic?
That's a great question. So the first one, if you leave this blank, the thing is you can't leave it blank, but people will use, so one of the older laws is that interfaith marriages are not recognized by the state. So what you have people do is that when your ID card expires in 5 years, you just put on it, you say, I know a Christian woman who wanted to marry a Muslim man. Their families agreed, but one of these outstanding laws from the pre-democratic period was that you cannot have these interfaith marriages. So what people will do is they will change their ID card to say, well, we're both Muslim. They'll get married, and then they'll switch it back to say that they're Christian. So, there are very small populations of people who either identify as atheist or agnostic, or Judaism in Indonesia is not recognized, but there are Jews that live in Indonesia. And a lot of times they will just choose a religion to put on their card, but then in practice. So it's just kind of for the government as an official tally, but what people, their private practice will be different. Your second question about Malaysia and Indonesia being recognized by the broader Muslim world. I think increasingly it's being recognized. I still find in Islamic studies as a PhD student that it's still this idea that it's this, well, it's kind of Muslim, but it's so mixed in with local tradition that it's not really Muslim. I think that's starting to dissipate. That it is, you look at Indonesians are the biggest contingency to go to Mecca for the Hajj. A lot of Indonesian students will go to, especially to Egypt, to Al-Azhar University for their studies. A lot of Islamic scholarship is coming out of Indonesia, so I think increasingly it's being recognized as just as Muslim as the rest of the world, where before I think it was still a question. But great questions. So what I look at is thinking about women, and I think Byron talked about this a little bit. So the women that I work with mostly the Minangkabau population, which is spread between Sumatra and Malaysia as well a little bit in the mainland Malaysia. And what's interesting is that all people that identify as ethnically Minangkabau will identify as Muslim. This is one of the areas that when the Arab traders came in, there was a lot of this intermarriage, and that people there do very much hold on to these practices, identify as very pious, and it's very rare to see someone who is not. But it's kind of, and so much of it is tied into, where it's one of those instances where the religion and the culture intertwine. But what's interesting with the Minangkabau and all of these are some of the activist groups that I work with. And you have the women that wear the longer veils, that wear the niqab, the face covering, who are out there bringing donations to the tsunami sites, who have political demonstrations. And Minangkabau women, so it's a matrilineal community. So all of the property goes through the mother's line, which in Islam, it goes through the paternal line. And I work with a lot of divorced women, interestingly enough, who have initiated their own divorces, who go to the Islamic court and say, my husband is not fulfilling his husbandly duties and I want a divorce. They say, I'm Minangkabau, I have my right. And they tell their husband, they say, the house is my property, you leave. Mm-hmm. It's Minangkabau. Minangkabau. It translates to the winning buffalo. Winning buffalo. from some of the earlier wars. But it's just this idea that these women who, and a lot of my friends that I work with wear these very long gowns, they wear the long veils. A lot of them now are starting to cover their face. A lot of these women own their own businesses. They are single mothers. They travel extensively. They run, one woman runs tours to Mecca for Umrah, for the minor pilgrimage. So it's just really trying to dispel this misconception that you look at these women and you see them with their faces covered or with the long veil, that they are kind of, they're subservient to their husbands. A lot of them just got rid of their husbands because they were done with them. Or that they still hold on to, that there isn't this tension that, well, we are matrilineal but also Muslim, that I'm a woman who owns property and I will pass it to my daughter, but I'm also Muslim, and that's fine. And you have as well, so you have, this is in Padang in West Sumatra, where you have mosques that, this is the water buffalo horn design that matches the traditional house. So in the architecture, Indonesian Islamic art, there is a huge gap in the literature about that. So and then you see, especially in some of the Javanese shadow puppetry, you have some of the characters that become, Kiai is a man with a lot of Islamic knowledge. So you have characters that were traditionally from the Hindu stories that become marked as religious figures in these stories. So you do have this mixing of culture where you have these beautiful mosques that have their own designs that match the local culture and local tradition. And again, this question of culture, Indonesian culture and Islam, where these things just come together, and then how, especially with this question, how this is recognized. Actually, the mosque in Padang is one of the most famous tourism sites for Indonesia because of that. So you have this idea of syncretism, so this idea that it's Islam that gets mixed up, that it's this kind of melting pot, or orthodox, that it's straight by the book. And Indonesians themselves disagree on this. You know, what is Islamic, what is not? What should we do, what shouldn't we? And a lot of that depends on people's educations, kind of what schools of Islam that they subscribe to, and this idea of what's religious doctrine, what is culture, and who gets to decide that. And then thinking about language, so this idea that you have, and especially now that I'm studying Arabic, there is so much Arabic in Indonesian. Knowing Indonesian has made Arabic much easier, but you have the word wajah, which means face, comes out of Arabic. Istirahat is rest or a break, comes out of Arabic. Umur, amr, is also, so age. But you have all of these words coming in that when you look at these Austronesian languages, if you look at Malay and Indonesian especially, there's got to be at least 30% that's Arabic. And then maybe 5 to 7% that's Dutch. And then you get all of these English loanwords coming in because this is the era of technology, and you can manga print your essay. You can manga friend someone on Facebook. So this idea too, if you teach foreign languages, which is something that is near and dear to my heart, this idea of languages as something that are constantly growing and changing. Spanish, if any of you teach Spanish, so much of Spanish is coming from Arabic, especially from the 700 to about 1492 in southern Spain. So there's that. And then thinking about the economy, that Islam in Indonesia has a huge influence on the economy. So you have banks that are like Bank Muamalat that are, and also other national banks that have the Sharia banks, which don't have the usury, so that are meant to be for Muslims, that they can take loans without interest. You have halal tourism is a big thing right now in Indonesia, where it's having a lot of these visiting both holy sites, but also having tour groups where you make sure that the food is halal, that you take breaks during the day to go to pray, you visit all these different mosques and learn about the Islamic history in different places. You have the halal stamp that is distributed by the Majelis Ulama, is the Muslim scholars or the advisory board in Indonesia. So you have, if you want to open up a restaurant and you want the halal stamp, you need to petition and pay and you can pay a little bit more to expedite, which happens. Halal marts, a lot of homeopathic medicines are coming up as being these halal medicines an alternative to Western medicine. So people going to these halal marts for, as opposed to going to the pharmacy for their drugs. And then also just a lot of Muslima fashion. So these outdoor markets where you have people that are shopping for the hijabs or for the dresses, a lot of it comes in a lot of imported goods from the Middle East. So dates are wildly popular, anything that, a lot of honey, and some of the gowns that people buy, a lot of it is influenced. They have Muslim Fashion Week, they have fashion shows. So a lot of that drives it. And a lot of it is driven by the Hajj as well. So in Indonesia, with the allowance from the Saudi government, there's a waiting list of about 20, I think right now it's about 19 years, it's gone down a bit. So if you want to go for Hajj, you have to sign up, people will sign up their children when they're born, so that maybe you can go in the Hajj when they're 20 years old. Indonesia sends the biggest Hajj contingency, and Indonesia, there's a big gift-giving culture. So people will go and shop. They spend a lot of money on these packets to go for Hajj, and for Umrah as well, for their food, for their lodging. The tourism market in Indonesia right now to go to the Middle East is astounding. And then you also have these Haji Plus package. So if you want to skip the line and pay $10,000 and stay in 5-star hotels and have a caterer, you can pay for the Plus package, which is also increasingly popular with people that have the means for it. So this idea of religious obligation mixing with status, mixing with economic means in this financial market. So a lot of people are capitalizing on this right now. And then you have the problem of the media. So anytime my parents worry about me in Indonesia because all they see on the news is there was an earthquake, there was a tsunami, here's a church bombing. So it's this idea that what we see in the media is often case not what's going on in Indonesia, and it's these isolated cases. So last summer was the church bombing in Surabaya. That was just a very isolated single attack and a single person. And then that becomes this idea of Indonesia being less tolerant. Last year, there was a blasphemy case that was very high profile against a Christian governor, which was just led by a very small group of people, but a very loud group of people. That made national news in the New York Times, BBC, in Aceh, thinking about some of the laws against, if you think about homosexuality or adultery, some of the corporal punishment that happens, that it becomes the big news story. And thinking about the Bali bombings in 2004. So these are the things that we see on the news that often paint the picture and become the big discourse. Indonesia is less tolerant. The Islamic State is coming to Indonesia. When really, when you talk to people, 99% of them want the message to be told that Indonesia is a tolerant country. Indonesia is not like this. This is what the media portrays us. So thinking especially about media portrayal and how we engage with that. So my last part here is thinking especially about Muslim youth. This is mostly stories about my experience in Indonesia as an English teacher in a public high school. Thinking a little bit about the education system, and then also thinking about ways that your students can engage with learning about Muslim teenagers in another part of the world, and how we can use that in ways to fight Islamophobia. So these are my English students and my co-teacher in front of the school that I taught at. I taught 14 English classes, which was a lot. It was mostly conversation. I coached the debate team, the drama club, and the English conversation class. So I was at school all the time. I lived right behind the school too, so there was no excuse. So education in Indonesia, and I'm focusing mostly on secondary, but you have elementary school and middle school. So elementary is 1st through 6th. Middle school is 7 through 9, and then 10 through 12 is high school. So you have the public senior high school, which is where I taught. That is government run, that is all access for everyone. You also have public vocational high school is SMK. They're directed at different trades, so there's for people that want to go into engineering, there's mechanics, there's art and handicrafts. Now they have some, I think, for like flight school. So those students can choose to do that. You have public Islamic high schools, which is focused more on religious knowledge as well as your typical studies. And then you have private schools, which usually it's a single organization that owns a elementary school, middle school, and a high school. And then you have Islamic boarding schools, or pesantren, where students will live in a boarding school and they get more of an intensive Islamic education, and the goal is to become an Islamic scholar. And in all of these schools, religion is taught as a mandatory subject. So especially in the public senior high school and the vocational high school, the ones that you will have a mixed population of students, they will have, so the Muslim students will have their Islamic studies class once a week, and the Christian students will have catechism, and the Hindu and the Buddhist students will have their own. So even if you have 2 Hindu students in your entire school, they have their own teacher and their own religion class. And then the other days of the week, you learn the other religions. So all the students will be conversant in the practices of, so you have a Muslim student who can tell you all about Jesus from the Catholic perspective and from the Muslim perspective. You have Buddhist students who can recite Islamic prayers. So it's this idea that you are learning the world religions, both your own and everyone else's. In the Islamic schools, it's mostly Muslim, it's all Muslim students. So they do more intensive focus on religious study. And then you have, and I can play these later on during the break, you have Rohis, is Rohani Islam, which means it's Islamic spirit. And this is an extracurricular activity that students will do, where they will host Quranic reading competitions. They will do, a lot of them do a cappella groups. They'll do a fashion show. But it's for students who are really interested in their faith. So you have karate club, you have Mandarin club, and you have like your Islamic club for after school activities that students can choose. That's becoming very popular. So students will spend their time, they'll do cooking competitions. So it's just a way that students with similar interests can come together to learn more about their faith, but also spend time. And competitions are huge in Indonesia, so having a forum for that is something that's popular for students. And these Quranic reading competitions, you have very young children that learn to read the Quran. So this question about Arabic, a lot of them can read these verses beautifully, but they cannot tell you what it says unless there's a translation next to it. But it's this idea that this oral practice that is part of an Indonesian tradition is very important as an Islamic tradition as well. Yes? I did. I was fortunate. The school that I was at was one that was very academically rigorous. And in Indonesia, students are split. You're either on a science track, so students that will study physics, biology, chemistry, or a social track, so students that focus more on economics, history, social studies. And it's kind of, if you're on a university track, it kind of prepares you for either STEM or for the social sciences or the humanities, though there is crossover in both. But students who, if you're in social, you won't be taking upper level biology, which they're really happy about. But English is compulsory. So you have English as compulsory, and then you have English as an elective. So some students will have it twice a week. Most of my students were very conversant in English, as were for my cohort for Fulbright. Most of our schools, we had a lot of English, but it's thinking about English as this global language, and students being very motivated. Plus, they watch a ton of YouTube. They love American film. They love all the pop songs. So I had one student with perfect British English, and she learned it on YouTube by herself. And you couldn't hear a trace of an accent. So English is there's often, especially with the younger generation, a lot of English and motivation to speak English, which you don't always see with American students learning Spanish, unfortunately, as I did in my classroom. So I was in Pacambaru, which is the little red dot, with my co-teacher at the school that I taught at. So there were about 1,000 students, I think, spread across 3 grades. And the school is all outdoors. So the teacher moves from class to class, and you don't have hallways. You just enter the door and come out. So students will be all together with their same class all the time, so they become very close-knit. So it's not common that you meet up with your 10th grade class 5 years down the road. Or I know older women who are in their 70s who meet with their elementary school classmates. So it's these very close-knit communities that are formed. The teachers don't always know what's going on. There's always a lot of drama. Sometimes you'll call on a student to do a skit, and you just call 2 random kids, and they don't want to do it because they had a fight during math class. Crushes is a big thing. Dating's not really popular in Indonesia with Muslim students, but it's increasingly students will go together as a group with male and female students to the mall, and they'll have 2 students kind of walking a little close together, and everyone else is giggling. So it's not very different than what we see. So if you have a Facebook account and want to check it out at some point, we made a Humans of New York style page called Students of Smandel, which was the nickname for our school. And it's pictures of the students and just whatever caption they felt like giving it. Either they answered a question. So Azura is one of my Muslim students who does not veil. Some of her family is Christian. Her great-grandparents had converted to Islam. She's mostly comfortable in a long pair of shorts and a t-shirt. She hates her school skirt. She veils when she has to pray at school. She takes it off when she's done. And she likes debate because of all the handsome guys she gets to meet at the competitions. And music is really big. They love singing. I became a wedding singer against my will several times in Indonesia. But students will come together and play music after school. So these were 2 of my social students that would sit there and play songs. They could sing in Arabic, they could sing in English, they could sing Indonesian songs. They wrote their own music. Raras was one of my debate students who really didn't want to be a doctor, even though her parents really wanted her to. So being a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer. She wants to own her own business, and she's in college now. She's in one of the top universities in Indonesia in a pre-MBA program. She will be studying abroad in France next year, and she's told her parents that she was not going to be a doctor. And she was in Rohis. She won most of the chronic reading competitions in my school, so she's one of my very religious students. But very much wanted her parents to know that she was going to be independent. She didn't want her husband to just provide for her, and she wanted to have a stable income before she said, I'm not getting married till I'm 30. So there's also like a Red Cross group for students that were interested in volunteering. So students said, do you want to be doctors? Can do that. So they would help some of the local first responders as part of this. So a lot of volunteerism, just like what we have here for activities. So we'll leave it at that. If we have a couple of minutes, if you want to, just given all of that, if you have questions, we can take questions. If you want to discuss among yourselves, thinking about the topics that you teach, the types of students that you work with in your own school communities, and ways that this might be helpful both for thinking about curriculum, but also thinking about Muslims and Muslim teenagers around the world and how that might be a tool for having students understand a little bit more that there are more similarities than differences, and recognizing those differences as something that can encourage conversation. So at Oakland Catholic, at the high school I worked at, we actually had during our activity period, and if anyone is interested, I do work with a network of schools that are interested in working with schools in the United States and having like either a pen pal program or they love practicing their English. Or just having these ways and teachers as well that are interested in connecting. And Fulbright also has a program and I can give you the information when I look it up. For teachers that are interested in learning more about Islam and just Southeast Asia more generally, there's I think a 3-week program to Indonesia. And I know some of the alumni from it as well, where you do school visits. It's for educators especially. It's a full scholarship. It covers all of your travel and expenses. But if anyone is interested in Indonesia, claimed my heart. So, but yeah, any questions or discussion, feel free.